the U.S. Like today, an earthquake shook the Bay Area. 2:39 this morning, and it was centered 2 miles east-southeast of Berkeley on the Hayward Fault, according to the United States Geological Survey. And they held a press conference about that. Let's listen in.
Magnitude 4.4 earthquake just south of the University of California, Berkeley, on the Hayward Fault, most likely. Probably hundreds of thousands of residents of the Bay Area felt it. It was about 8 kilometers deep, 8 miles deep, 12 kilometers deep, and the Hayward Fault, it's not unusual to host earthquakes like this. In fact, there have been about 3 or 4 earthquakes of this size in the past 10 years in this area. So this is an area that commonly produces these earthquakes about this magnitude on the Hayward Fault. And this is a reminder that we live in earthquake country. It sounds like not much damage has been done. That's great. But it's a wake-up call, literally and figuratively, for all of us, and reminds us to be prepared.
What about the possibility that this is a foreshock? What are the odds of that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So looking historically at all the earthquakes that have happened in California, about 5% of the time earthquakes are followed by larger earthquakes. So there's a low probability, but there is some probability that this is a foreshock to a bigger event. And honestly, that it wouldn't be a big surprise if we had a big earthquake on the Hayward Fault. The last big earthquake occurred in 1868. We're about at the 150-year anniversary for the last big earthquake of the Hayward Fault. And so we know from geologic excavations that big earthquakes on this fault happen about every 150 years. So people like me, geologists and seismologists, think that a large earthquake on the Hayward Fault is probably the most likely earthquake to occur in the Bay Area in the near future.
Can you speak of the depth of the earthquake, because it was widespread and a lot of people felt it?
Yeah, this earthquake, right now we think it had occurred at about 8 miles or 12 or 13 kilometers deep, which is relatively deep for earthquakes on the Hayward Fault. The fact that it was so deep means that it was felt over a wide area. Shallow earthquakes are felt over smaller areas. Deeper earthquakes, the earthquake energy radiates to a much broader region. So a little bit unusual that it was deep, and the aftershocks that are starting to occur will illuminate or highlight what part of the fault actually ruptured during this earthquake. And the first aftershock we've seen also has been deep. So it's interesting. It contributes to the widely felt nature of the earthquake. Other than that, not a lot to say about the depth.
Can you tell us more about that aftershock?
Not a whole lot. All I know is there's been one aftershock in the area since, and that's shown on this map here. I imagine in the coming days we'll see more. Hopefully not large ones, damaging earthquakes, but the smaller earthquakes, they help us as scientists understand what happened in that main shock, the magnitude 4.4 event.
It's interesting. A lot of people said that this felt bigger than a 4.7, and they were saying that it's comparable maybe to the Napa quake, maybe just shorter. Why would they have that type of feeling? And is it just inexperience with earthquakes?
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. So I live in Albany. I was I woke up to this earthquake, and I have a little bit of history. I've lived in the Bay Area for almost 25 years. The things that I think about: how long did the shaking go on? What's the duration of shaking? How intense was it? And then you have to think about the types of materials you're on, the soils you're on. The soft soils around the bay margin tend to amplify shaking. But our early indications are the shaking might actually have been a little bit low for an earthquake of this magnitude. So I don't think if people are telling you that they felt it was intense shaking given the magnitude, I don't know that they're right. But it's a little bit early to make conclusions about that.
And we have this photographer right here actually felt it in Santa Cruz.
Wow.
Which seems remarkable considering that it was the Hayward Fault there and reaching all the way into Santa Cruz.
Yeah, so it's been about an hour since I checked our Did You Feel It page, but an hour after the event, which happened in the middle of the night, there were tens of thousands of people who had already contacted our Did You Feel It page. And I encourage everyone to go in and do that. That information really helps us understand the distribution of shaking around the Bay Area. The shaking was widespread. That's not unexpected for an earthquake of this magnitude.
Can you tell us, are we ready for something bigger than this?
Well, let me turn that around. Are you ready? I would say we're doing better than we used to do. there's still lots to be done. And the one piece of advice I offer people is to think about the buildings in which you spend time. The schools your children go to, your office, your home, are those buildings going to withstand strong shaking? And for most people, the answer is, I don't know. So then I suggest you consult an expert. It is the older, vulnerable infrastructure that tends to do damage in earthquakes.
Was this only on one fault, as far as you know?
As far as we know, it looks like it was on the Hayward Fault. The epicenter plots right on the Hayward Fault. The type of slip that occurred during the earthquake is the type of slip that one would expect in a Hayward Fault earthquake. So again, this is not unusual. We have these kinds of events on the Hayward Fault. I like to think of this as a stuck patch. The Hayward Fault, some of you may know, is slowly creeping. As time goes on, it slowly creeps, and the two sides of the fault move past each other without much in the way of earthquakes. But there are patches where the creep is inhibited. Either the rocks are rough or they're tightly clamped there, and every once in a while those stuck patches, they slip, and that produces an earthquake, and it produces a smaller earthquake. And it tells us that the Hayward Fault is indeed moving and has the potential to produce larger earthquakes.
Can you tell us what the USGS does now and how you study this particular earthquake and what it could mean for the future?
We do a lot of things. We monitor earthquakes. We do research into how earthquakes occur, why they grow to certain sizes, and we do hazard assessments. So we put out information about future likely shaking, and those hazard assessments are consulted, in fact, by the building code. So new buildings are built according to information that we help develop with our partners. For this particular earthquake, we had hundreds of seismic instruments in the ground mainly. We also monitor how some structures behave, and they sense this earthquake, and those monitoring instruments are what allow us to tell you about the history of earthquakes here in the Bay Area.
In terms of warning signs or warning instruments to tell us ahead of time that one is coming, are we advancing in any way in that regard?
Yeah, so you're asking about a program that we call Shake Alert, or Earthquake Early Warning. We're in developmental stages of that together with partners, with state agencies, with universities, and that Shake Alert project was operating this morning. According to early reports, there was a 4-second delay until a message was sent out after the earthquake occurred. So preliminary investigations tell us that the earthquake early warning algorithm that we currently have working worked pretty well. We're not issuing public alerts at this point. We hope to begin issuing some limited alerts sometime this year. And the way this earthquake early warning system works is if we have a dense network of seismometers in the ground, the first ones to sense the shaking, they collaborate with their partners, send information to a computer that calculates the magnitude, and then because that magnitude and location information can be transmitted very fast via almost the speed of light, which is faster than earthquake energy travels, we can send that message out ahead of the earthquake energy, and we can provide an earthquake. Once the earthquake has started, then we warn people that the earthquake energy, the shaking, is headed their way.
You get this question asked a lot. As one happens, does that tell us another one might be happening soon, or there's no relationship?
There are a number of answers to that question. Basically, we live in earthquake country, so we should all expect earthquakes. Recently, with this earthquake, there is a potential that it's likely that there will be aftershocks. There's also a small probability that this earthquake will be followed by a bigger earthquake. There's some indication that earthquakes trigger earthquakes at remote distances. Those ideas have been developed by colleagues here at the USGS and elsewhere over the last few years to show that in some examples, the shaking from one earthquake sort of unclamps another fault and causes an earthquake there. We don't see any evidence of that with this particular event.
Of the faults that we have in the Bay Area, is the Hayward Fault the one that is most active, or?
Yeah, so we do these hazard assessments, and we look at all the faults in the Bay Area, when they've experienced earthquakes in the past, what geologic evidence is there for earthquakes, and we've calculated that the Hayward Fault is the most likely to produce a large earthquake, and by large we mean larger than magnitude 6.7. And we think there's roughly a 1 in 3 chance over the next 30 years that there will be a large earthquake on the Hayward Fault. Now that matches the idea that the last big earthquake occurred in 1868, about 150 years ago. And we know from geologic excavations that the average recurrence for big earthquakes on the Hayward Fault is about 150 years. So the Hayward Fault is a likely suspect.
But technology now, the last big earthquake so long ago, how important is this data that you just got today?
This is not out of the ordinary. So it's really nothing, this is sort of business as usual. These kinds of events happen on the Hayward Fault pretty regularly. This is just a reminder that we're in earthquake country.
Now, we've seemed to experience a higher number of earthquakes that people could feel over the last year or so. I know that at least that's the perception. Would you say that's a reality, or would you say that maybe it's just ones that now that we have social media, we're able to communicate with each other a lot better?
Yeah, probably the latter. I think people may hear more about it. I think I have statistical seismologist colleagues, and they look at the rate of earthquakes and whether there are more earthquakes going on. And there are no recent studies that show that we're having more earthquakes now than we used to, or even more large earthquakes than we used to. Over time, things tend to average out. And I think, and this is a good thing, we're learning more about them. And people are learning more about earthquakes, and they're learning to be prepared. This shaker this morning is a reminder that the Hayward Fault is ready to go.
And I'm sorry, I wanted to touch on one more thing that Sid asked you about the early warning system. I'm sorry, if you could go over that again. What system do you have in place? What did it do today, and how does it work?
So we have a system called Shake Alert. It's in development. We're not issuing any kind of public warnings. It works on a few seismologists and USGS and our collaborators, university and state agencies, on their computers. So what it does is this Shake Alert system, the sensors in the field sense an earthquake. The first few that sense it, they send a message to a computer, that computer processes the information, calculates where the earthquake is and how big it is, and then it sends out information, and that information travels faster than the earthquake shaking. So people, once the earthquake has happened, they can get a little bit of warning that the intense shaking is headed their way. This development system is in operation now, and preliminary indications are that there was a warning issued of an earthquake 4 seconds after this earthquake occurred. So enough time for people who are at a distance to take actions and protect themselves.
4 seconds after?
4 seconds after the earthquake began.
Oh.
Yeah.
How much time are you talking then before
It gets to
Travel.
San
Well,
Jose. Let's say San Jose or to the South Bay. They're from Berkeley to the South Bay.
Yeah, so first of all, we're probably not going to be issuing these alerts for earthquakes of this magnitude for 2 reasons. One is these earthquakes tend not to do damage, and 2, there are a lot of these earthquakes, and we'd be issuing earthquake warnings all the time. But having the system up and running and testing it and improving it is really valuable to us. Now, how much warning time any individual gets depends on a number of factors. It depends on how far they are from the earthquake, how big the earthquake is, and how dense the seismic network is, and how rapidly those computers are processing the information they're getting from the seismic network and sending out the signal. So there's no one answer, and if you're close to the fault that caused the earthquake, it's likely you won't you won't get any warning, because the time it takes for the shaking to get to you is less than the time it takes for this system to work and provide you a warning. So it's only those people who are at some distance.
So generally, would it be seconds or minutes?
Most commonly, it's going to be seconds to maybe a couple tens of seconds. Under the ideal from a scientific perspective setting, if an earthquake happens, say, on the very northernmost end, if it started on the northernmost end of the San Andreas Fault, which is, over 100 miles from here, and we had a dense network of stations and they sensed it and they sent out messages, we could have more than a minute of warning here in the Bay Area, in the core of the Bay Area. But that's sort of the ideal setting. Earthquakes aren't ideal, but from a scientific perspective, that would provide us the longest warning.
You're down to 4 seconds now, so what was it at before? I mean, I take it this is an accomplishment to get it down to 4 seconds, and then to bring it obviously lower and lower until you're actually sending out an alert at the real time. start time?
Yeah, so again, this is a developmental system. We're hoping to be issuing some limited alerts to partners and
all right, everybody, again, this was an earlier today press briefing from the USGS about the 4.4 magnitude earthquake that shook the Bay Area this morning.